Because cynicism towards politicians is so popular, attacking them for broken promises is a very common thing to do. But most of the time, lawmakers, in particular presidents, work as hard as they can to follow through on their campaign pledges. And as you can see here in our video on the 10 promises we're glad presidents broke, linked down below, when they do go back on their word, the public is often glad that they did. That makes the rare instances in which a president goes back on a promise against the public wishes very notorious. How often has that happened though? Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to break down the 10 most infamous broken promises by presidents in US history. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too, tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're looking at decisions by presidents made that directly contradicted a campaign pledge and either hurt their standing with the American public at the time, became condemned by history, or both. They specifically have to be pledges while campaigning for president. So although Andrew Johnson's leniency towards the South in Reconstruction was a departure from his initial pledge to be punitive toward the Southern planter aristocracy, whom he referred to as traitors due to the Civil War, he made that pledge while being selected as Abraham Lincoln's vice president and then initially upon becoming president after Lincoln's assassination, not while campaigning for president himself, which he never did. Also, the pledge has to be a direct, broken promise, not an unintentional one because they were hamstrung by Congress or the Supreme Court. For instance, Ulysses S. Grant's failing to follow through on his civil service reform campaign pledge was due to Congress refusing to act, not necessarily his lack of will to address it, so it doesn't make the list either. These decisions may not have cost the president their re-election bid either. In fact, many of them were smart enough to break their promise after they got a second term. But they all live in infamy. Now let's dive in. Number 10. Richard Nixon, ending the Vietnam War. Although he did technically fulfill this campaign promise eventually, he broke it first. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 on a pledge to withdraw US troops from Vietnam using the phrase peace with honor. President Lyndon B. Johnson's popularity had plummeted due to his escalation of the war, so much so that he didn't seek the Democratic nomination in 1968, and his vice president, eventual nominee Hubert Humphrey, also had to pledge to end the war, breaking from the administration in the process. The public went with Nixon largely on the belief that he was more likely to keep that promise, even trusting him as he said he had a secret plan to end the war. And that just got him over the hump, as he won with 301 electoral votes, but by a margin of just 0.7 percentage points in the popular vote. 6 months into his presidency, Nixon began removing troops. However, Nixon also escalated the war by secretly bombing Cambodia at the time via Operation Menu in order to disrupt Viet Cong and North Vietnamese supply lines in the region, since the Cambodian government was providing a sanctuary to the pro-communist forces. This was all part of a plan drawn up by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a noted humanitarian known for how much he deeply cared about civilians across the globe. Just kidding. The idea was even as the US withdrew, if they destroyed Viet Cong and North Vietnamese sanctuaries in other countries while also supporting the South Vietnamese troops fighting them, they could still win the war. Nixon, just like LBJ, was unwilling to accept defeat. To be fair, it was also a preemptive way to safeguard American soldiers as they withdrew from Vietnam. Even without the full extent of the Cambodian bombing being known at the time, Nixon's slow, staged withdrawal from Vietnam, combined with his support for the South Vietnamese anti-communist forces in the form of weapons and resources, sowed distrust with the anti-war protesters that he may not have really been serious about ending it. Then in April of 1970, months after a coup in Cambodia, Nixon announced a public bombing campaign in the country under the pretext of supporting its new pro-US regime against communist forces, a clear broken promise that sent the anti-war protest into full swing once again. How did he handle the protesters? Well, he fostered an environment that encouraged National Guardsmen to shoot and kill them. Literally. Less than a week after he expanded the war, Ohio Governor James Rhodes sent the state's National Guard to Kent State to quell protests that had gotten out of hand. The protest turned deadly as the guardsmen fired into a crowd of mostly peaceful, unarmed anti-war protesters on the campus, hitting 9 and killing 4. Nixon, for his part, raised the tension that led to this environment by referring to the protesters as bums blowing up their campus 3 days before the guardsmen went, and publicly and privately calling on state and local officials to get tough on the protesters. Several other beatings, shootings, and yes, killings by law enforcement ensued as the protests continued across the country over the next few weeks, most notably the killings at Jackson State, an HBCU in Mississippi where 12 anti-war protesters were shot and 2 were killed. After ending his campaign in Cambodia, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in the process, Nixon expanded the war into Laos in 1971 for the same reason he expanded it into Cambodia, killing up to 200,000 civilians there, or 10% of the country's population. That was 2 neutral countries he bombed as a way to continue the efforts of a Vietnam War he pledged to end. By most estimates, just as many Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died under Nixon as they did under LBJ. About 40% of American soldiers died under Nixon, not far behind LBJ. Add in the deaths of Cambodia and Laos, and far more died under Nixon overall than LBJ, so it's safe to say he lied. And most importantly, none of it worked. In fact, it made things worse. In 1975, South Vietnam fell to the communist forces of the North Vietnamese army, and because of the damage Nixon had done to the country, Cambodia became wildly unstable and fell to Pol Pot's communist guerrilla army that same year, something that may not have happened had Nixon not expanded the war to there. Still, none of this cost Nixon in the 1972 election, as he won 49 of 50 states and captured over 60% of the popular vote, but he was helped by running against George McGovern, who ran arguably the most disorganized campaign in history and showed a complete lack of conviction toward everything he ran on. What really helped Nixon win, though, was despite the expansion of the war, he was bringing the troops home, and in September of 1971, he signed an executive order to end the draft, which would go into effect at the start of his second term. What we learned about the 60s with the 72 election was that many of the anti-war protesters were frauds. They didn't oppose the Vietnam War, evidenced by their support for Nixon's re-election after opposing LBJ. They just opposed having to go fight it themselves. As long as poor, less fortunate Americans, often of color, were the ones dying, they were perfectly happy with mass slaughter of civilians elsewhere in the world. To be fair, Nixon and Kissinger began negotiating an end to the war during 1972, and Kissinger announced a peace deal was imminent in October, 1 month before the election. They made good on that promise, officially reaching a final agreement to end the war in January of 1973, the same month the draft ended. So he did fulfill his promise in the end, but he broke it first, not that the voters cared. The extent to which Nixon broke his promise did not become known, though, until after he resigned from office due to Watergate, when Congress completed several investigations over a 2-year period about lies, misconduct, and cover-ups related to the war. It didn't cost Nixon at the time, and he did eventually follow through on his pledge, but to many people, he's now more infamous for those actions in which he initially broke his promise than he is for why he was actually removed from office. Number 9. Warren G. Harding, hiring the best minds. Although he's most famous for his return to normalcy pledge, Warren G. Harding's 1920 campaign also focused on a 20th century version of civil service reform. Remember, this was at the end of Woodrow Wilson's second term, and the combination of World War I, the Spanish flu, and the economic depression during the election year meant that the best way to win was to be everything Wilson wasn't. That meant withdrawing from the world stage and ditching the era of progressive reforms to government in the first 20 years of the 20th century, which Harding did, following through on his return to normalcy pledge. It also included hiring the best people in government, as Wilson appointed a lot of his cronies to certain positions. Harding said he would hire, quote, the best minds, and he even promised to appoint African Americans to high-ranking federal positions, a direct shot at Wilson's racism in the federal government. This all worked on the campaign trail, and Harding won the election with 404 electoral votes and 60.4% of the popular vote, becoming the first person to win over 400 electoral votes in a race with only 2 major candidates. His opponent, James Cox, never really had a chance, seeing as he was a Democrat, the same party as Wilson. Anyway, Harding immediately reneged on his promise to hire African Americans to high-ranking federal positions, and he instead gave many jobs to his political allies, just like Wilson. Having served as a U.S. Senator and Lieutenant Governor representing Ohio, Harding brought a group of people who had been working with him for years known as the Ohio Gang to the White House to serve in cabinet and advisor roles. They took jobs they weren't qualified for and used them to enrich themselves. Not only was Harding explicitly involved in some of the corruption, but he was also not one of the best minds for the job, something he admitted himself when he said he wasn't fit for the presidency and never should have been elected to it. The most notable of these instances is the Teapot Dome scandal, where Harding's Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, leased petroleum reserves designated for the Navy at Teapot Dome in Wyoming, along with 2 locations in California, out to private oil companies at low rates without competitive bidding. Fall accepted bribes from those companies in the process, and in 1929 was sentenced to a year in prison after a federal investigation. But that wasn't the only scandal. Charles Forbes, director of the Veterans Bureau and another Harding appointee, was pressured to resign and eventually sentenced to 2 years in prison after it was revealed he embezzled $2 million from the Bureau. Harry Dougherty, also connected to the Teapot Dome scandal, served as Harding's attorney general and stood trial twice for allegedly doling out illegal Prohibition-era medicinal alcohol permits in exchange for kickbacks. And when his private secretary, Jess Smith, reportedly had a pending arrest for his involvement in such affairs, he committed suicide. Almost none of this came to light until after Harding died in 1923, but it made him go from beloved to hated really fast. And while this may be a broad promise, it certainly was a broken promise because he very clearly did not hire the best minds. Number 8. Thomas Jefferson, protecting the free press. One of the greatest champions of freedom of speech among all our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson was the perfect candidate to run for president in 1800 to unseat John Adams, who had signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it a crime to criticize the government. This was before Marbury versus Madison established the precedent of judicial review at the Supreme Court, so there was no way to stop Adams from grossly violating the Constitution. Jefferson heavily criticized Adams for those laws and accused him of running a tyrannical government as a result, even painting him as just another British monarch. Running as a strict constructionist, Jefferson painted the free press as a cornerstone of the new government, essential to its survival, and he painted himself as somebody who would uphold the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment. That won over the public and resulted in Jefferson winning the election by capturing 73 of 138 electoral votes, 9 of 16 states, and 60.8% of the popular vote. And in his first year in office, he pardoned everybody convicted under the Sedition Act. But during his presidency, it became pretty clear Jefferson only supported a free press when it criticized government officials he didn't like. Jefferson encouraged states to prosecute Federalist newspapers hostile to him, particularly after James Callender published rumors, that we now know are true, that Jefferson fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings. Now, technically, you might say that's not a violation of Jefferson's principles, because there was no 14th Amendment at the time, so states weren't bound by the First Amendment. But Jefferson used his direct influence at the federal government to make sure states with politicians loyal to his party would prosecute such journalists. And it's certainly true that even the federal coercion to restrict speech would have violated Jefferson's said strict constructionist principles. One notable case was that of Harry Croswell in New York. Since New York State was completely run by Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, Jefferson used political pressure and leverage over its leaders to charge Croswell with libel for writing that Jefferson paid, ironically Callender of all people, to attack Adams and George Washington in his writings. Although Croswell was convicted in 1804, the case brought to light that Jefferson did provide financial support for Callender's pamphlet, The Prospect Before Us. So Croswell was telling the truth. Croswell was never sentenced, and New York changed its law in 1805 to declare truth an absolute defense of libel, which eventually became a nationwide principle. There's no doubt in that instance, Jefferson used his influence at the federal government to suppress any speech critical of him, a clear violation of what he ran on in 1800. None of this hurt his re-election bid, though, as he won in 1804 handily with 162 of 176 electoral votes and over 73% of the popular vote against Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who did try to use Callender's Sally Hemings story against Jefferson, but wasn't about to critique Jefferson's attacks on the press, given the Federalist Party's reputation for the Alien and Sedition Acts. Others will bring up the case of Jefferson supporting Connecticut prosecuting 2 Federalist editors who accused him of bribing Napoleon Bonaparte to facilitate a treaty with Spain in what eventually became a Supreme Court case, the United States versus Hudson and Godwin, but in Jefferson's defense, that was actually a lie. They could be sued today for writing that. The Croswell case, though, is indefensible, remains infamous with those committed to the free press, and is another mark on just how complex and contradictory Thomas Jefferson's legacy is. Number 7. Barack Obama, warrantless wiretapping. There are plenty of broken promises by Barack Obama to criticize, from saying if you like your healthcare you can keep it, to running on immigration reform, to pledging to close Guantanamo Bay, to saying he'd cut the deficit in half, to reining in home foreclosures. But almost all of those promises were broken because he either didn't foresee certain circumstances or he couldn't get Congress on board with something he pledged to do. They weren't intended broken promises, if that makes sense. Warrantless wiretapping is a completely different story. During the 2008 election, a common Democratic critique of George W. Bush and his administration was how they expanded the authority of the National Security Agency under the Patriot Act in response to 9/11, allowing the NSA to collect phone, internet, and financial records of any private U.S. citizen for no reason whatsoever. To many, this was a gross violation of the Fourth Amendment. While running for president, Obama was one of the harshest critics of the Bush administration for this level of warrantless wiretapping. He pledged more transparency and no more infringement on civil liberties if elected.
I will provide our intelligence and law enforcement agencies with the tools they need to track and take out the terrorists without undermining our Constitution and our freedom. That means no more illegal wiretapping of American citizens.
Given the financial crisis and Iraq War, this had nothing to do with Obama capturing the White House, as he won in a landslide with 365 electoral votes and by 8 percentage points in the popular vote, despite his incumbent being the popular war hero John McCain, a maverick known to buck his own party. But it was a factor, especially since McCain publicly supported the program. In July of 2008, though, Obama voted for the expansion of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, to allow for even more surveillance on private citizens. It was an inexplicable vote at the time, but we now know Obama voted for it so he could have the powers he pledged he wouldn't abuse when president. 5 years into his presidency, though, in the summer following Obama's re-election, NSA contractor Edward Snowden began leaking the extent of widespread government surveillance programs by the US and its allies to The Guardian and The Washington Post. What we found out was that the new level of warrantless wiretapping by NSA officials wasn't to protect Americans, but was to serve their own interests. They did things like spy on old girlfriends, and at the behest of the executive branch, oftentimes listened in on conversations involving members of the press, political opponents, or even foreign leaders. But rather than course correct what should have been a major scandal and was a clear broken promise, Obama's administration decided to criminally prosecute Snowden. Snowden fled the country to Hong Kong and eventually to Moscow, where he lives to this day. To be fair, in response to the backlash, Obama did sign the USA Freedom Act in 2015 that limited the NSA's powers, granted right after 9/11, but he never promised a pardon for Snowden if he returned to the US, sending a clear message that you had better not ever expose a presidential administration for its illegal acts or broken promises. There's a chance if this came out a year earlier, Obama doesn't get reelected. It was a major scandal. After all, Mitt Romney was his opponent, and as a former governor, Romney wouldn't have been stained by the Patriot Act, so it could have been something he used against Obama. Instead, Romney lost by 3 percentage points and 332 to 206 in the Electoral College. Given the focus on the recovery from the Great Recession in that election, maybe it has no impact on Obama, but we don't know for sure. Shamefully, neither president to follow Obama has pardoned Snowden either, despite one saying he would at least look at it, which he hasn't done. He's next on our list of infamous broken promises, albeit for a totally different reason. Number 6. Donald Trump. Mexico will pay for the wall. Just like Barack Obama, Donald Trump has a laundry list of broken promises that we can more easily track since his presidency is recent, or in this case, current. From pledging to repeal and replace Obamacare to only pursuing repeal, to sending additional troops to Afghanistan in his first term despite pledging to draw down US involvement in the Middle East, to saying he would renegotiate the Iran deal but just pulling out, to saying he would prosecute Hillary Clinton and not doing it, to saying he would release the Epstein files in his second term but then having to be forced by Congress to do so and still fighting the release of all of them. There were plenty of things to hit Trump on in terms of broken promises. However, saying he would get Mexico to pay for a wall along its border with the US to stop illegal immigration from the southern border was the most direct one. He literally shut down the government in an attempt to break this promise. This was a cornerstone of Trump's first campaign for president in 2016. At the time, the Tea Party movement, a group of conservatives fully committed to just cutting government spending in general, was very powerful in Congress and dictating the direction of the Republican Party. So Trump getting the nomination on this pledge made the right look hypocritical since the wall would obviously be a big federal spending project. Trump's way around that was saying he would force Mexico to pay for the wall through forced economic coercion by blocking the money immigrants in the US send back to Mexico, tariffing Mexican imports, increasing border and visa fees for Mexican immigrants and tourists, deducting foreign aid, a border tax on products coming into the US from Mexico, and renegotiating trade deals that would be punitive to them.
Mexico will pay for the wall.
How effective this was in his general election victory against Hillary Clinton, who was heavily favored, remains a topic of debate to this day. But it certainly helped him get out of the Republican primary, and given the fact that he beat Clinton by just 70,000 votes in 3 states, capturing 306 electoral votes despite losing the popular vote by 2 percentage points, it likely at least contributed to getting him over the top, specifically in Arizona, a state on the border. Trump began construction on the border wall by first diverting federal funds from other projects via executive order in his first year. He then changed his pledge to Mexico would eventually pay for the wall. Congress then granted him $1.6 billion for 100 miles of border wall construction in 2018. However, after the Democrats won back the House of Representatives in 2018, but before they took office in 2019, Trump pledged to veto any spending bill that didn't have $5 billion for the border wall funding. This triggered the only shutdown in history that went through 2 separate Congresses, which you can learn about more here in my video on every government shutdown in US history, linked down below. Eventually, Trump caved and reopened the government, but declared immigration a national emergency in February of that year, which got tied up in the courts but didn't halt his construction. It didn't matter though after he lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, who halted construction on the wall for the first 2.5 years of his presidency. But Trump never made any moves to get Mexico to pay for the wall in his first term. We forget because of COVID's prominence in 2020 all of the other factors in the election, but given the fact that Biden won by only 40,000 votes in 3 states despite capturing 306 electoral votes and winning the popular vote by 4.5 points, there's a chance that Trump's broken promise on Mexico paying for the wall had an impact, again particularly in Arizona, which Biden barely won. To be fair to Trump, he did claim in 2020 that the new trade deal he negotiated with Mexico, known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, resulted in the US getting more money from Mexico that was enough to indirectly cover the wall expenses. But he just pulled it from other federal spending projects in his first term. And in his second term, he signed the Big Beautiful Bill, which allocated over $46 billion to fund the wall, and since the bill is projected to add $3.4 trillion to the federal deficits over the next 10 years, it's safe to say USMCA isn't offsetting the cost of the wall anymore. So by any reasonable metric, this is a broken promise. Number 5. Andrew Jackson. Reform in the federal government hiring process. There are plenty of reasons to look at Andrew Jackson's presidency and see he clearly wanted to be a dictator. Ignoring Supreme Court orders, executive overreach with things like increased vetoes and bank wars, and suppression of dissent by supporting things like the gag order on discussing slavery in Congress are all examples. But a common tactic of dictators is to fuel their own personal corruption under the guise of government reform, and Jackson did that better than anybody. Running as a champion of the common man, Jackson lost a 4-way race to John Quincy Adams in 1824 despite beating every candidate in the race by at least 15 electoral college votes and 8 percentage points in the popular vote, winning a plurality of both. All because Congress gave the election to Adams, widely believed to be due to fellow candidate Henry Clay, then Speaker of the House, wielding his influence to make sure Adams got the win in what became known as the corrupt bargain. This move only fueled Jackson's populist appeal against the federal government, and he used that to come back to beat Adams in a 2-way race in 1828 by 11 percentage points in the popular vote, and with 178 of 261 electoral votes, ushering in Jacksonian democracy and the Democratic Party as a major political party in the process, also ushering in the second party system. A key part of Jackson's appeal was his promise to reform the hiring process of federal officials. Jackson campaigned on turning the federal hiring process into a rotation, where nobody would hold the job permanently, so the positions could be held more accountable to the democratic process. He pledged that the positions would no longer be a part of what he deemed a corrupt bureaucracy, and also said there would be more government efficiency with the move. On both fronts, he failed. As president, Jackson fired 10% of the federal workforce and replaced them with people who supported his campaign and new party. It's one thing for a president to do that with cabinet rules, but Jackson did it pretty much down the line with the federal government. The roles of the workers didn't change either, so it was still a bureaucracy, and the way they were hired was corrupt. So he did nothing about the corrupt bureaucracy with these moves. The rapid turnover and lack of experience caused more scandals and increased hostilities with the Native Americans, since many new employees used their position to violate the legal rights of indigenous people for personal profit. It created numerous issues, so needless to say, it wasn't efficient. In reality, these quote-unquote reforms were just a pretext for Jackson to stack the federal government with his cronies. It didn't stop him from getting reelected in 1832, again in a 4-way race, but with Clay as his primary opponent this time, capturing 219 of the available 288 electoral votes and winning over 54% of the popular vote, 17 points more than anybody else in the race. But these issues all set the stage for the crises that followed immediately after he left office, most notably the Trail of Tears, and also the Panic of 1837, since the spoils system allowed a lot more reckless land speculation. Almost 200 years later, the spoils system is universally condemned by historians. Its existence created a culture of quid pro quo, a culture that led to the assassination of a president in James Garfield in 1880, so while it didn't hurt Jackson in the moment, it does make him look bad now, and it was indeed a broken promise since he pledged on more efficiency in the federal government when he ran. Number 4. George H.W. Bush. No new taxes. Probably the most blatant broken promise in modern American history, George H.W. Bush pledged to not raise taxes in his 1988 campaign for president. Bush was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and although Reagan was directly responsible for the largest net decrease in personal income taxes in history through multiple budget bills he signed, there were numerous individual moments when he raised taxes, particularly excise, corporate, and capital gains taxes with his 1986 overall tax cut. To many people, those were violations of Reagan's campaign pledges to lower taxes, even though, as mentioned, he followed through on that and did net lower them dramatically. Anyway, as Bush was gearing up to succeed Reagan, he was already going to have trouble with the low-tax conservative wing of the party, since despite representing Texas, he was seen as coming from the northeastern liberal wing of the party given his family dynasty's New England ties, particularly to Massachusetts and Connecticut, where he was born and raised respectively. It didn't help that in the 1980 primary for president, he referred to Reagan's tax cut policy as, quote, voodoo economics. Amidst this backdrop, Grover Norquist, head of the U.S. advocacy group American Tax Reform, created a no new taxes pledge for the 1988 primary and encouraged every Republican to sign it, and Bush eventually did out of pressure in 1987 after initially refusing to. And with the name recognition of being VP, that was enough to get him out of the primary. But in the summer of 1988, Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis led Bush by as many as 17 points in some national polls, and while a post-convention bounce was seen as part of that, lukewarm support from Bush's conservative base was another part. As a result, Bush entered the Republican National Convention doubling down on his no new taxes pledge, making that the central theme of his campaign to draw a contrast with Dukakis, who said because of ballooning deficits, raising taxes might have to be a last resort. That led to this infamous line at the RNC.
Read my lips.
The pledge, combined with Reagan's popularity and a very aggressive campaign against Dukakis that branded him as a Massachusetts liberal, helped Bush go from losing to winning in a landslide, capturing 426 electoral votes and winning the popular vote by 8 points. It remains the only time since Harry Truman in 1948 that a candidate was elected president after his party had served 2 full terms or more in the White House, and it's the last time any candidate has ever received over 400 electoral votes. As 1990 arrived, however, the deficit continued to rise, and with a Democratic Congress, Bush wasn't going to get any spending cuts unless he agreed to tax increases. Principled in his deficit hawk stance, Bush went back on his word and supported a pledge to raise taxes in the summer of that year, and he reached a deal with Congress in September. But the conservative wing of the party, led by House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich, turned on him over the deal, and this actually led to a government shutdown in October. Once again, you can learn more of that in my video on every shutdown in history, linked down below. Eventually, Bush reached an agreement with less extreme tax increases and less deep cuts to social services. This partially cost Bush in the 1992 election, as Pat Buchanan mounted a credible primary challenge to damage his candidacy over the tax increases, nationalizing the paleo-conservative movement with his insurgency campaign in the process, and Ross Perot mounted the most credible third-party run in modern American history, siphoning off votes from many traditional and moderate Republicans, despite the fact that he campaigned on a tax increase in 1992. But conservative Democrat Bill Clinton was the beneficiary of all this, becoming the first Democrat to win the presidential election in 16 years. He beat Bush with 370 electoral votes and won the popular vote by 5.5 percentage points, despite only capturing 43% nationally, as Perot captured just 19%. In hindsight, though, Bush deserves credit for torching his political career to do what he believed in. He did not have to sign that budget in 1990, but he was committed to lowering deficits and willing to break a campaign promise to do it. And his decision actually paved the way for Clinton to balance 4 budgets in the late 1990s. That doesn't happen without Bush's leadership. Still, it was certainly an infamous moment, largely because the promise was so blatant and on camera for everybody to see. Number 3. Woodrow Wilson. fair treatment of African Americans. There were multiple reasons Woodrow Wilson was able to become the first Democrat to win the White House in 20 years in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt running a third-party candidacy as a member of his new Bull Moose Party is the biggest reason, as he challenged his initial chosen successor, Republican William Taft, for not being progressive enough on policy, despite the fact that Taft used the Sherman Antitrust Act to actually break up more businesses in his first 2 years as president than Roosevelt did his entire 8 years in office. Anyway, that split led to Wilson winning 435 electoral votes, becoming the first candidate ever to win 400 electoral votes, despite capturing just 41.8% of the popular vote in a four-way race that also included socialist Eugene V. Debs, who would eventually become a thorn in Wilson's side in his second term, which we'll get to soon enough. Although he cleared every challenger by 14 percentage points in the popular vote, one of the unique things Wilson did to shore up his support was attract black leaders with his New Freedom platform, which pledged a, quote, absolute fair dealing with African Americans. This resulted in him doing better with black voters, the ones who could actually vote, than any Democratic presidential candidate since the Civil War at that time, and won him the support of influential civil rights figures of the time like W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, Bishop Alexander Walters, and Booker T. Washington. This support was in response to the growing Lily White movement, an initiative by Republicans to reduce the role of black people in their party and exclude their needs from the platform out of a pragmatic approach to appeal more to white Southerners since they were a larger voting bloc. Taft was a member of that movement. Before that, Roosevelt's handling of the Brownsville affair, in which he discharged 167 members of the African American 25th Infantry Regiment, stripping them of their pensions and any shot at federal employment in the future, all because they were framed for killing a white bartender and shooting a white police officer in Brownsville, Texas without any evidence, further drove a rift between black people in the Republican Party and drove many of them toward Wilson. Unfortunately for them, Wilson turned out to be a straight-up liar. Rather than deliver any fair deal for African Americans upon his election, he resegregated the federal workforce, excluded black people from federal appointments and promotions, and downgraded and sometimes outright fired several black federal employees because they were black. He screened D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation at the White House, the propaganda film that promoted the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, of which Wilson, who was from the South, fully embraced. Even in his second term, at the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson made sure the United States did not support a racial equality clause to the League of Nations covenant that affirmed all nations and alien nationals would be treated equally and just, regardless of race. But honestly, that was at the end of a war that leads to our next broken promise by Wilson. Number 2, Woodrow Wilson, World War I neutrality. The only president who made it on here twice, Woodrow Wilson left office hated for a reason. Unfortunately, rejecting promises to black voters wasn't going to cost him a second term in 1916 as it should have. Just being a Democrat in that era was actually a tougher hurdle. But with World War I breaking out in 1914, Americans were deeply worried and divided about getting involved. Although support for the Allies was strong mostly, that didn't mean support for going over there to fight was. And there was a growing contingent of German immigrants in the country who may have had divided loyalties and who pushed hard for the US to stay out of the war. And this was a significant voting bloc for the Democratic Party during this time. So Wilson offered supply, food, and financial aid to the Allies, but didn't get involved. And in his 1916 re-election bid, Wilson branded himself as the neutrality candidate. He kept us out of war was Wilson's campaign phrase, and it was enough for him to get re-elected, as he won 277 electoral votes and won the popular vote by just over 3 percentage points. It certainly helped that his opponent, Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes, had no consistency in opposing Wilson. He painted Wilson as an interventionist for supporting different factions of the Mexican Revolution, but at the same time said greater mobilization was needed to prepare for the war, making him look like the war candidate. You can learn more about that in my video on the 10 worst campaigns in US presidential history linked down below. Wilson made the case that intervention in Mexico was just to keep Germans from coming over to the Americas so the US would not have to get involved. Simply put, Wilson was painted as the anti-intervention candidate on the day of the election. A month into his second term, he broke that promise and got the US involved. The pretext was that German U-boats sank American merchant ships around the British Isles. But that had been going on since 1915, and in February of 1917, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare, so Wilson knew this was inevitable. Truth be told, he was always going to get the US involved in the war, and maybe it was necessary, but he outright lied on the campaign trail. Not only did he get involved in the war, but he brought back the Sedition Act to jail anti-war protesters, a move that was unfortunately upheld by the Supreme Court initially before it was overturned. This, combined with the Spanish flu and post-war economic depression, made him wildly unpopular with the public by 1920, despite the US winning the war. And it's why he didn't have the political capital to get the US to join the League of Nations. It's also why, as we mentioned earlier, Harding won in such a landslide in 1920. Perhaps had Wilson been honest with the public, or less directly dishonest, there wouldn't have been such a backlash to everything he stood for by the 1920s, as the US turned back toward isolationism and away from the progressive era, which caused the Great Depression and led to the rise of Nazi Germany. Those two things actually vindicated Wilson for a long time among historians, but it was the way Wilson went about his agenda, blatantly breaking such promises, that made what he was doing so hated at the time. Before we get to our most infamous broken promise, I want to address a couple of honorable mentions. George W. Bush ran against nation building in the 2000 election and then seemingly violated that pledge with the Iraq War. However, nation building was his justification for remaining in Iraq, not the initial reason for going. Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction and making Iraq a potential breeding ground for terrorists were the pretext for the war, and while those were downright lies, and the war is one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century, it wasn't sold as a nation-building project initially. When Bush was criticizing nation building, he was particularly targeting Bill Clinton's administration and Vice President Al Gore, his opponent in that race, for turning humanitarian missions in places like Somalia into nation-building missions. That's entirely different from going to war with a nation and seeing the need to occupy it after you overthrow its leader for the sake of stability, which is what he attempted to do in Iraq, regardless of how unjustified it was. So we can't call it a direct broken promise. Joe Biden did break a pledge to not pardon his son Hunter Biden after his own Justice Department secured gun charge and tax offense convictions. He did make that pledge while running for re-election in 2024 as well, and then pardoned him his last month in office. But since Biden dropped out of the race, it didn't technically fit the broken campaign promise either. And the number one most infamous broken promise by any president in US history, James Buchanan, popular sovereignty. With slavery already threatening to trigger a civil war, James Buchanan decided to make it worse by becoming president with a position that already upset anti-slavery forces, and then moving away from that to a position that was even more pro-slavery while in the White House, alienating large swaths of moderates in the process. Throughout the 1850s, the debate on slavery was split several ways, from those wanting to expand it into new territories, those wanting to ban it in new territories, abolitionists who wanted to ban it altogether, and unionists who sought compromises to hold the country together and keep kicking the can down the road. Buchanan himself had a compromise position known as popular sovereignty. It basically called for letting the settlers in those territories decide if they wanted to be slave or free. This stemmed from the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Buchanan's predecessor, Franklin Pierce, signed to create the territories of what would eventually become those two states, and giving each territory's settlers the right to choose whether or not to be slave or free, a violation of the 1820 Missouri Compromise that banned slavery in that area. This led to Bleeding Kansas, basically a civil war in that territory, influenced by outside pro and anti-slavery forces, violently fighting over whether or not the state should be slave or free. Buchanan ran for president at the height of this war against former Whig President Millard Fillmore, a member of the Know Nothing Party who ran as a Unionist on the platform of the Compromise of 1850, which he was the one who signed, and John C. Fremont, a member of the upstart Republican Party, founded in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act on the platform of banning slavery in the new territories. Because Buchanan campaigned on popular sovereignty, which seemed to be the most rational stance at the time given how much slavery was dividing the country, he won the election in a three-way race with 174 of the available 296 electoral votes and 45.3% of the popular vote. Literally 2 days into his presidency, he violated that pledge. Buchanan was inaugurated March 4th, and the Supreme Court issued its ruling in the Dred Scott decision on March 6th. That decision ruled against Dred Scott, who was enslaved in Missouri, but sued on the grounds that he should be legally free when his owners had taken him into the free states of Illinois and Free Territory of Wisconsin. But it didn't just stop by ruling against Scott. With Chief Justice Roger Taney writing the majority opinion, it barred all territories from outlawing slavery, struck down the Missouri Compromise, and stripped all U.S. Americans of Black African descent from their citizenship, holding that the rights of the U.S. Constitution does not extend to them. The ruling on territories and rights of Black people explicitly violated popular sovereignty and wasn't what they were supposed to be ruling on in the lawsuit, so the Republicans didn't recognize any of that ruling. But Buchanan still endorsed it, pledged to enforce it, and we now know was secretly corresponding with Supreme Court justices as early as 2 months before his inauguration, encouraging them to issue that ruling, even though it directly violated his stance on popular sovereignty. That was confirmed in the early 20th century, by the way, that he was corresponding with them, but it was suspected immediately given the fact that he stated in his inaugural address a ruling was coming that would, quote, speedily and finally resolve the question of slavery in the territories. But Buchanan didn't just violate his popular sovereignty pledge there. Less than a year later, Buchanan endorsed the Lecompton Constitution. This was a proposed constitution of Kansas as it moved towards statehood, the second of 4 unveiled while Bleeding Kansas was going on, that was strongly pro-slavery, protecting the territory's right to slavery and granting it the right to exclude people of color from its Bill of Rights. That constitution was approved by a rigged election in December of 1857, but then defeated in January of 1858 by a majority of voters who actually lived in the Kansas territory. Despite the public's rejection in that territory, Buchanan wrote a letter to Congress a month later urging it to admit Kansas under the Lecompton Constitution. Popular sovereignty was already an immoral and cowardly position, by the way, but by doing this, Buchanan even violated that stance against slavery and made his position very clearly much more pro-slavery than he portrayed himself to be on the trail. He also blatantly ignored the rampant fraud and abuse by pro-slavery forces to even get that constitution passed in the first place, which in and of itself was a broken promise because Buchanan could have used the federal government to enforce fair voting in Kansas since it was a territory, even in 1857, and that was a necessary action to uphold the promise of popular sovereignty. It's not like Buchanan was against using federal forces to quell anything going on in the country. Look at John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But all Buchanan was focused on was keeping the southern wing of the Democratic Party happy and bringing a quick end to Bleeding Kansas, making him arguably the most short-sighted president in history. And by not enforcing fair voting while endorsing the Lecompton Constitution, he completely alienated the popular sovereignty wing of the Democratic Party and its most prominent supporter, Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who despite all his faults, deserves credit for leading the charge in Congress to block the admission of Kansas to the Union under that Constitution when it came up for a vote in March of 1858. That move helped Douglas beat Abraham Lincoln in the 1858 Senate election and become the Democratic nominee for president in 1860, but it also split the party, as John C. Breckinridge represented the Southern Democratic wing of the party, while John Bell represented the Constitutional Union Party, which made up the Unionists this go-round and honestly was so outdated. Anyway, Buchanan's broken promise had a huge hand in Lincoln winning the election, despite capturing just 39.7% of the popular vote and 180 of the necessary 303 electoral votes. But not because the broken promise split the Democrats and caused the four-way race, believe it or not. Lincoln won an outright majority in 15 states worth 169 electoral votes, with only 152 needed to win, so he would have beaten any other candidate in a two-way race. What really happened is Buchanan's decisions radicalized many more people in the North towards the Republicans, largely because they were super annoyed at just how committed pro-slavery forces in the South were to forcing their way of life on everybody else. More than anything, it was a resentment election, a backlash against the Southern Democrats that Buchanan had caved so much to. Historians generally view Buchanan's indecisiveness as a reason for him to potentially be the worst president ever, and that's certainly true with his campaign stance on slavery and how he handled secession after Lincoln's election. But that still gives him too much credit. In between those two periods, Buchanan was very decisive and going out of his way to appease the pro-slavery forces, only making matters worse, which is why he actually doesn't get enough criticism for how bad of a president he was. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. What would you say is the most infamous broken promise of all time by a president? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more History Buffs Hub videos in the future.